George Sterling woke up to the sound of silence, the kind that filled marble halls and empty hearts. His first thought wasn't about the expensive silk sheets tangled around him, or the taste of the aged bourbon still on his tongue. It was this: wait, have I died before? He sat up slowly, the realization hitting like cold water. This wasn't just any mansion. It was Sterling Manor, the fortress of the man everyone called a monster, himself. The chandeliers gleamed like smug reminders, the portraits on the wall showed a face too handsome to be trusted, and his phone buzzed with messages from trembling subordinates. "Sir, the merger is complete. The competitors have filed for bankruptcy." "Excellent," George muttered automatically. Then he froze. Wait, this is exactly how Chapter 2 of the novel started. That's when it clicked. He wasn't dreaming, he transmigrated into his own villainous body from the novel. In that story, he was fated to destroy the heroine's company, torment her, and eventually die in poetic despair when the hero swooped in. But George now had the upper hand, meta-knowledge. And his first instinct: avoid Serafina Sterling, the radiant, stubborn, tragically doomed female lead, at all costs. He laughed, a low, sardonic chuckle that echoed off the gilded walls. And it sounded easy enough. Until he realized something strange. The next morning, without warning, his butler announced. And George froze mid-sip. She was here already. The plot had started moving on its own. And despite his resolve, one look at her, sunlight spilling over her golden hair, eyes filled with that fierce, unshakable faith, and George felt something dangerous stir in him. The story was supposed to be a tragedy. But maybe, just maybe, he could rewrite it. "All right," George said with a lazy grin. "Let's see what happens if the villain flirts with fate instead." George Sterling didn't believe in fate, not anymore. But as Serafina Sterling sat across from him at the breakfast table, framed by sunlight and surrounded by scandalous amounts of luxury, he began to suspect the universe had a cruel sense of humor. She was breathtaking, graceful yet strong, with that same spark he remembered from the novel, the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of wolves and make them roll over. But in this version of reality, she was already his wife. That part wasn't in the book. The original George had married her to seize control of her late father's corporation. It was a power move, cold, strategic, ruthless. Serafina was supposed to despise him. But the way she looked at him now, cautious, observant, yet oddly soft, told a different story. "You didn't come to bed again," she said quietly, cutting into her omelet. "Meetings," George lied smoothly. "The board doesn't sleep." In truth, he hadn't known what to do. Last night he'd spent hours staring at the mirror, trying to recognize the monster staring back. She sighed. "George, you have more than enough. Why keep pushing?" "Habit," he replied. Then after a pause, "or boredom?" "Yes. Boredom. You own half the city." "Exactly my point." For a fleeting moment, a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. That smile, in the book, was the signal for the hero's grand entrance, the point where she began doubting her loyalty to her cold husband. But there was no hero here. Not yet. Just George, sitting there realizing that maybe, just maybe, the villain had been the loneliest person in the story all along. The silence between them stretched. Serafina's voice softened. "I just wish you talk to me. You're not the man you used to be." If only she knew why. Gee. And the incoming transmission, chapter event trigger, hero's first appearance delayed. George blinked. What the hell does that mean? Hey. Gia. What? And for the first time, Serafina smiled genuinely. Maybe this wasn't such a bad rewrite after all. Days passed, weeks even, and still no hero. George Sterling had expected fate to strike swiftly. In the original story, the hero, one Damien Cross, would have already appeared by now, flashing his self-righteous grin and rescuing Serafina from her cruel husband. This. And so George grew bored. The boardroom battles, predictable. The corporate wars, effortless. The expensive art, private jets, and secret villas, meaningless. He sat in his penthouse office one evening, staring out over the glittering city, a glass of whiskey in hand. The lights below looked like tiny sparks of stories that still mattered. His didn't. "What's the point of being a villain," he muttered, "when no hero bothers to show up?" That night, instead of attending a gala or making another acquisition, he went home early. He found Serafina in the garden, barefoot in the grass, reading to their two small children, twins, with her eyes and his smirk. It was surreal. In the novel they'd never existed, but here they were laughing, real, warm, alive. "Daddy," the boy shouted, running to him with tiny arms wide open. "Hey there, champ," George said, awkwardly catching him. He'd faced hostile takeovers and assassination attempts, but this felt new, terrifyingly fragile. "You're home early." "Yes," George replied, kneeling beside her. "I fired boredom for the day." She laughed, a genuine sound that felt like sunlight breaking through fog. And for the first time, George realized something unsettling. He okayed this. The domestic quiet, the laughter, the peace. It wasn't supposed to be part of the script. Yet he couldn't imagine losing it. Later that night, as he tucked the twins into bed, Serafina lingered at the door. Gee, maybe I'm just rewriting the story. But deep down, he knew stories never liked being rewritten. Because somewhere out there, fate was watching. And the hero was finally on his way. It happened on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Monday, not a stormy Thursday, just a completely ordinary Tuesday, the kind George hated most. The phone buzzed in his pocket, a single message. "Hero has arrived. Estimated confrontation 3 days." George froze. 3 days. 3 days to prepare for a hero, who was years late according to the original plot. He laughed aloud, startling his butler. Years overdue, and now they finally decide to show up. Typical. Serafina appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Show up for what?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. George smiled, sharp and mischievous. "Oh, just someone trying to ruin my life, again." For 3 days, George moved like a predator in his own mansion. He played with the idea of confronting this hero before he even arrived, testing security systems, reviewing financial defenses, and preparing his own counterplots. But when the day came, George found himself laughing. The hero Damien Cross finally appeared. Handsome, idealistic, annoyingly righteous, the classic protagonist. Yet he looked tired. "George Sterling," Damien said, voice firm as if rehearsed from the script. "I'm here to save Serafina and—" "Gee, save her, my dear hero. She's been perfectly fine without you. And she's married to you, and—" "With children," George added, leaning back in his chair, sipping whiskey. "2 little ones. And I might add they are adorable, fiercely loyal, and already smarter than you." The hero's jaw tightened. "And call me what you want," George said casually, smirking. "But tell me, when was the last time a villain was bored, especially when the hero is late and the leading lady has already blessed him with children?" Damien opened his mouth, but no words came. He wasn't prepared for this version of George. The meta-knowledge, the calm amusement, the sheer ownership of his life, it was like the villain had leveled up. And George realized with a faint thrill, this is going to be fun. The hero was here. The original script was crumbling. But George Sterling, he wasn't playing by the old rules anymore. George had always enjoyed winning, but this was effortless. Damien Cross had arrived, full of righteous indignation, ready to dismantle George's empire and rescue Serafina. The plot dictated he should succeed, that George should stumble, that the villain must fall. But George had been awake. "Damien," George said calmly, swirling his glass of whiskey as he leaned against the marble railing of his private office. "I hear you've come to stop me. Let's see how that works out." Damien's fists clenched. "Step aside, George. You don't belong in her life. "Oh, I belong," George interrupted, voice smooth like silk. "And I've been here years before you. I already built the life you think you can save." He flicked a finger at a screen displaying a live boardroom meeting. Within minutes, George demonstrated how Damien's attempts to freeze his assets, sabotage his deals, or blackmail his associates were systematically dismantled. Each move Damien made was countered before he even finished thinking it. Damien's frustration grew, a storm cloud forming over his perfect hero image. This isn't possible. You're supposed to lose," George supplied, smiling faintly. "Not today, pal. Today the villain gets bored and wins. The quantity will be quantity." By the end of the day, Damien left the mansion, humiliated but alive. The hero of the story, a complete joke. Geo. With. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his whiskey, smiling as the sun dipped behind the skyline. "Boredom," he murmured, "never felt so satisfying." George Sterling, villain extraordinaire, had discovered a shocking truth. Domestic life could be far more complicated and far more satisfying than world domination. The mansion had settled into an unusual rhythm. The children ran wild, Serafina managed the household with quiet authority, and George, well, he lounged, observing, scheming, and occasionally interfering in the most dramatic ways possible. "Daddy, I built a castle," one of the twins shouted, holding a precarious tower of blocks. "Impressive," George said, kneeling beside them. "But it needs a moat, and maybe a few dragons. Don't skimp on the dragons." The children giggled. Serafina watched, shaking her head. "Yes," George admitted with a sly grin, "but only because they deserve it, unlike those boardroom fools." George found that his boredom had turned into a kind of creative mischief. He spent entire afternoons plotting ridiculous pranks around the mansion. Booby-trapped snack cupboards, exploding glitter cannons for unsuspecting staff, and a self-driving toy car programmed to chase the children just enough to keep them entertained. Yet beneath the humor there was a subtle sense of power, a thrill George hadn't felt in years. Here, he wasn't just the villain, he was irreplaceable. That evening over dinner, Serafina asked, "Do you ever miss it, the old life, the chaos?" George leaned. "Something." He looked at his children, their faces glowing in the soft light of the chandelier. "I may be the villain of some story, but in this story, I'm the hero of my own life. To be. Just don't get too comfortable. You know how stories go." George smirked, the faint edge of amusement in his eyes. And somewhere in the shadows the world waited. The hero might return, fate might intervene, but George Sterling, the bored villain with a family, had already claimed victory. George Sterling was enjoying a rare moment of peace in the garden. The twins were chasing each other around the fountain. Serafina was tending roses, and George was trying to decide whether to nap or plot a minor, evil prank on the gardener. Then the phone buzzed. Hero attempts second confrontation. Estimated outcome, failure. George laughed aloud. Finally, some entertainment. Within hours, Damien Cross showed up again. He had clearly studied his previous mistakes and was armed with new strategies, corporate lawsuits, whispers to the media, even attempts at social sabotage. Classic hero tactics. But George, ever the aware villain, was ready. The confrontation began with Damien barging into the mansion, dramatic as always. "George, this ends now. I will save Serafina and—" "Stop," George said, holding up a hand, eyes glinting with amusement. "I already told you no one needs saving, and I quite enjoy our little chats. makes me feel alive. Damien, you're a villain. You're supposed to be ruthless. Ruthless, maybe, but bored villains are far more dangerous. Over the next 3 hours, George demonstrated his dominance. TA. Media smear attempts were countered by well-timed press releases, showing George as a philanthropic genius. Quantity. By the end of the day, Damien was flustered, exhausted, and humiliated. The children, peeking through the window, waved and cheered as George strutted past, smirking like a king in his castle. Serafina J. You really don't take him seriously, do you? He's not a threat, George said, sipping his whiskey. He's just predictable, and predictable is boring. For the first time, George realized that he wasn't just defeating the hero, he was rewriting the meaning of villainy. No grand betrayals, no tragic downfall, just a bored, cunning man living life on his own terms. And who knew, he muttered to himself, that being a villain could be this fun? George Sterling had thought he knew Serafina Sterling inside and out. He had read the novel, memorized her behaviors, and anticipated her reactions. And yet that evening, she surprised him. They were alone in the library. The twins were asleep, and the mansion's lights dimmed to a soft, golden glow. Serafina sat across from him, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. George, there's something I need to tell you, she began, her voice quiet but firm. George raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, should I brace for scandal, confession, or melodrama? Serafina chuckled softly, a sound that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. None of those, she said. I've never been this happy, not before you, not before this family. George blinked. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass, trying to hide the faint warmth creeping up his neck. You're telling me you like me, that I'm doing a good job as the villain. She laughed again, but there was seriousness in her eyes. It's more than that. I love you, George. I've loved you for a long time. Maybe I shouldn't, maybe it's strange, but seeing you here with our children with me, I've never doubted it. The words hit George harder than any assassination attempt, corporate raid, or heroic intervention ever could. The villain in the novel was supposed to be feared, hated, destroyed. But here, he was loved. He set his glass down, leaning forward. I don't care about the book, she interrupted firmly. I care about you. Gio. Well, she rolled her eyes, but her hand reached for his. Their fingers intertwined naturally. In that moment, George realized something. The story had changed irreversibly. He wasn't just surviving fate, he was rewriting love itself. With you. And for the first time in his immortal villain career, George Sterling felt truly victorious. By now, Damien Cross was visibly unraveling. He had attempted every heroic maneuver in the book, yet George Sterling remained unshaken, mocking, clever, and disturbingly unbothered. It wasn't just that Damien had failed, it was how he failed. Every attempt to interfere with George's life ended with him looking foolish, overpowered, or outsmarted. The hero's aura of infallibility was crumbling. One afternoon, Damien barged into the Sterling estate yet again, panting, disheveled, and desperate. George, this ends now. I will not allow you. Allow me what? George interrupted, lounging in the grand drawing room with a rare bottle of scotch in hand. To live happily with your wife and children. Don't flatter yourself. You missed your chance years ago. Damien's. You're not supposed to be like this. You're supposed to. Die, George supplied, his grin sharp, dangerous, and utterly charming. Funny thing, Damien. The villain always dies in the script, but I read the script. I know how it ends, and I'm bored of that ending. Serafina, standing quietly behind George, crossed her arms and smirked. Age. The hero faltered, realizing just how little power he held in this rewritten story. His aura of righteousness was no match for George's knowledge, wealth, and most importantly, the loyalty of the woman and children he sought to rescue. George stood and approached Damien slowly, towering over him like the monster everyone feared in the novel. "You." Damien opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. His heroic energy was drained, replaced by helplessness. "Gee. So, my dear hero, why don't you leave before I really get bored?" Defeated, humiliated, and exhausted, Damien stumbled out of the mansion. For the first time, George realized just how lonely the original villain must have been. Only this time, he wasn't alone. "Victory is boring," George murmured to himself later, watching his children play. "But it's the kind of boring I like." With Damien thoroughly humiliated and the hero effectively neutralized, George Sterling settled into a peculiar rhythm. The empire was stable, the heroine content, and the children blissfully unaware of the outside chaos. And yet George was bored. Boredom, he realized, was the true luxury of a villain who had conquered everything. Money conquered, power conquered, reputation mastered, love secured. What remained? Mischief. That evening, he called in the mansion staff under the guise of mandatory maintenance, only to unleash harmless, hilarious traps. Ta. The cook's sugar turned into salt temporarily. A small army of mechanical mice scuttled across the drawing room during the twins' game. Serafina watched with a mix of exasperation and amusement. "George, you're ridiculous." "I prefer the term creative strategist," George replied, bowing theatrically. The twins, of course, found it all wildly entertaining. George watched them laugh, feeling a rare warmth he had never expected. Here, in his own home, he was both villain and entertainer, father and trickster. "Years. They." "Precisely," George said, grinning. "And you know what genius does when it's bored?" "No," she said, though she guessed. "It plays." That night George sat in his study, the twins asleep, Serafina beside him, and his mind racing with schemes of harmless mischief. The empire could wait. The hero was irrelevant. The story was his to rewrite. And for once, George Sterling realized that being the villain wasn't just fun. It was limitless. Life had settled into an almost peaceful chaos at the Sterling estate. George had grown accustomed to being both a feared villain and a doting father. He had mastered boardroom battles, tamed the late-arriving hero, and reveled in the subtle mischief of daily life. But one evening, Serafina called him into the study with an expression that hinted at a storm. "George, there's something you need to know about my family," she said quietly, closing the door behind them. George raised an eyebrow, swirling his whiskey lazily. "Oh, another plot twist. Do I get a dramatic monologue or just a secret inheritance?" Serafina's lips pressed together. "Both, actually." She took a deep breath. "Our family, we weren't as powerless as the story made it seem. The Sterling Corporation has hidden assets, research, investments, and influence that no one, not even you, knew about." George blinked, caught off guard. "Hidden assets? You mean there's more money and power under my nose?" "Yes," Serafina said. "And with them, I can protect our family from any threat, even if Damien or some other hero tries to come after us again." George grinned, suddenly older. I know. I always wanted to be independent, George, but I love you and the children. I don't want to fight alone anymore." "George is here." "They?" Serafina laughed softly, shaking her head. "I think you've already turned this villainy into something domestic." "Domestic villainy," George repeated with a mischievous glint in his eye, "much more satisfying than the old script." That night George stayed awake in his study longer than usual, planning. Not world domination, but household domination. With Serafina by his side and hidden assets at their disposal, he realized that the story he once knew wasn't just rewritten, it was upgraded. "Who needs heroes," he muttered to himself, "when the villain has everything and more?" Damien Cross was persistent, perhaps too persistent. George had thought the hero was finally out of the picture, humiliated and irrelevant, but apparently he hadn't learned his lesson. Late one night, Damien tried one last desperate ploy, breaking into the Sterling estate under the cover of darkness, hoping to rescue Serafina and prove his worth. George, of course, was waiting. "Ah, Damien," George said from the shadows, leaning casually against the grand staircase. "You really should know by now that the villain in this story doesn't sleep." Damien froze, realizing too late that every entryway, corridor, and hidden passage was under George's meticulous surveillance. You can't stop me. The hero always wins," Damien shouted, panic edging his voice. "Funny," George said, stepping into the moonlight, eyes glinting. "I've read the script, and in the script the hero always arrives late. You're extremely late, Damien, and incredibly boring." Using a combination of clever traps and his household staff, who were now sworn allies of his domestic villainy, George turned the mansion into a maze of harmless but humiliating obstacles. Damien was ensnared in a net, accidentally locked in the pantry, and finally tied up with ribbons by the twins, who thought it was all a game. "You've caused enough chaos tonight, Damien. It's time to leave." "George." "And remember," he said casually, "a villain gets bored only once. After that, the chaos is his domain." Damien slumped, utterly defeated, muttering something about fate being cruel. George chuckled, returning to his study. "Four." George Sterling sat in the study, the twins asleep in their shared room and Serafina quietly reading nearby. The mansion was calm, almost deceptively so. For the first time, George reflected on what he had truly accomplished. He had defeated every hero, rewritten the story, and built a family that loved him, not feared him. But he realized something important. His victories weren't just about money, power, or clever manipulation anymore. They were about legacy. "I wonder," he mused aloud, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "what it means to be a villain in a story that no longer exists." It means you've chosen your own ending. You're no longer defined by the plot, George. You define yourself. George. And what a delicious definition it is. No tragic death, no scheming hero to ruin everything. Just me, my family, and boredom that keeps me sharp. He thought of the twins and their laughter echoing through the halls, of Serafina's calm strength beside him, and of all the defeated would-be heroes who had underestimated him. "The villain," George murmured, "isn't supposed to be happy, but I've rewritten the rules. I've made happiness my weapon. Seraph, and your family is your fortress." George grinned. For once, the smirk wasn't just for intimidation. It was genuine, warm, and something even the original script could never have predicted. Damien Cross, once the shining hero of the story, had exhausted every possible attempt to reclaim his rightful place. Each failure left him weaker, humiliated, and increasingly irrelevant. By now, even his most loyal allies had abandoned him, realizing that George Sterling wasn't just a villain, he was untouchable. George, of course, watched all of this with mild amusement. He sipped his whiskey in the study while Serafina managed the twins' bedtime stories in the adjoining room. A final message arrived for George. "Hero status, null, retire immediately." George laughed aloud, a low, victorious sound that echoed through the mansion. "Finally," he muttered, "the hero realizes that some stories are not meant to be saved." Damien appeared one last time, not as a threat, but as a defeated shadow of his former self. "George, I suppose. You've won," Damien said, voice strained with frustration and defeat. George leaned casually against the doorway, smirking. "Won? I didn't even play your game. You lost on your own. That's the beauty of being a villain with foresight and patience." Damien swallowed hard, glancing at the twins sleeping upstairs. And Serafina, she's happy with you. Ecstatic, George replied. Better than she would have been in your storybook version, and that's something you can't undo. Damien. George. See, even heroes eventually get bored or just admit defeat. Serafina smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. I think this villain life suits you. Gee, bored villains, he said softly, make the best legends. George Sterling sat in the grand library, the warm glow of the fireplace reflecting off the polished wood. The mansion was quiet, peaceful, in a way he had never experienced in the original story. The twins were asleep, their soft breathing filling the air with a rhythm more soothing than any applause of victory. Serafina sat beside him, a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was watching him, and for the first time George felt completely seen, not as the villain, not as a plot device, but as himself. Do you ever think about the story? Serafina asked quietly. George chuckled, swirling the last of his whiskey. Every day, but the story's dead. The hero's gone, the fate is mine, and I've improved the ending. She smiled, her hand brushing his. And what's the ending, George? He looked at her, at their children, at the life he had carved out of the chaos of the original plot. The villain retires, the hero is irrelevant, the family thrives, and the boredom, well, that keeps life interesting. Will be. I never thought I'd hear the villain say something like that. That's the thing about villains, George replied, smirking. Who said we can't have happiness? Who said we can't love? He leaned back, letting the fire's warmth wash over him. The empire, the wealth, the power, all of it was still there, but it no longer mattered as much as this. Laughter of children, the quiet strength of the woman he loved, the freedom to rewrite fate on his own terms. For once, George Sterling felt complete. The villain who had once been bored, feared, and destined for a tragic downfall had finally discovered the ultimate victory. A life he controlled, love he nurtured, and a legacy he could proudly leave behind. So see. Gee. The fire crackled. The mansion was silent, save for the gentle breathing of the twins. Outside, the city twinkled, oblivious to the villain who had beaten the story itself. And for the first time, George Sterling wasn't just the villain. He was the happiest one in the world.